This is our Simondon reading group. We're returning after a couple weeks break. We're at page 144 in the translation. So we're on part 4 about invention. We're just in the opening of that part. So we've been talking about the behavior of a detour in various circumstances. So like the sort of simplest example of this is like you have like a rat in a maze. It learns a certain path to reach the food at the end of the maze, and then you change the maze. You put like a I don't know, a wall where before it used to be able to run straight through, and then the rat has to learn, okay, I can go down this other path and reach the maze, reach the end of the maze and reach the food. And Simondon points out that in the wild, many animals are capable of doing this kind of behavior. Like an example that I think he doesn't specify the animal here, but in other texts he mentions the same example, and he says that the jaguar. So in the wild, it's capable of tracking its prey and then realizing that it has to cross the river to follow the path of the prey animal, but then it can backtrack and find a spot on the river shore where the river is narrower or less deep or whatever, and it can cross the river and then go back to where it was and pick up the trail again. So it's taking a detour to reach the trail that it has to make to get across the river. But then in an experimental setting, so in a laboratory, when you have a simpler task of like getting around a maze and taking a different path through a maze, the animal turns out to not be capable of taking this detour. And so for Simondon, this capacity to take a detour, so this is a sort of most basic form of invention. It's the animal has to sort of find a way of reconciling the desire or the goal of reaching the food at the end of the maze and the obstacle, the fact that my path to the maze is blocked. So it has to sort of come up with a way of making these two incompatible bits compatible with each other. And for Simondon, this sort of behavior of invention is not something that is sort of inherent in the animal as an isolated entity. It's part of this animal environment interaction. And so this is why we see that in the laboratory setting, the jaguar is not able to perform this detour operation. And he specifically says that it had to do with the relation of an animal to its territory. So many animals, especially mammals, have a sort of territory behavior. So they have like maybe a nest or a burrow or whatever is like where they sleep, and then they have a certain region around that nest that they consider their territory, and they will defend it against other animals of the same species. And in this territory, they have this sort of detailed knowledge of the layout of the environment, so they know where the paths are, where to get to water, where to hide, so anything like that. And so on their territory, they're capable of performing all these detours and sort of creative, inventive processes of thinking, whereas in a laboratory setting, they're completely disoriented. They don't have those reference points or landmarks to work off of, and so they turn out not to be capable of the detour behavior. And so this detour or invention, creativity, whatever you want to call it, is a product not just of the animal, but of the animal territory interaction. So this is, I think, what we saw the last couple times. And he gives a few different examples of this sort of interaction of the animal with its environment and how it's capable of different types of creative behavior as a result of that interaction. Okay, so I think that's about where we are. So if I can get someone to read from page 144.
I can read. We're at yes, right?
Yeah, the paragraph break. Yes.
Okay. Yes, but on condition of specifying that it is a detour implying a representation and image more than a direct perception. This type of detour implies the representation of effects that are distant from actions, quote unquote, foresight, and the extended retention of a direction of activity, according to experiments by Hobhouse and Biren Dahan. The perception of an end inhibits actions which deviate from that end. Lewin has indicated the difficulty young children have approaching a goal backward, for instance, trying to sit on a chair. Even though backward walking belongs to defensive behavior in situations generating fear. Conversely, backward walking is a spontaneous behavior among certain load-pulling species, ants and spider wasps. From this point of view, we should note that there are different species of detour depending on whether the path involves an alternating proximity or distance from the goal, or displays instead progressive and continuous characteristics. In a case where a spiral chicken wire is spiraled around a goal, an animal will, if it is outside the wire, follow a continuous and progressive detour through the spiral. But if the animal is inside and the goal outside, the obstacle presents maxima and minima that are increasingly pronounced as the overall distance to the goal diminishes. A cat can solve the former but not the latter problem. W. and K. McDougall attribute success in detour problems to an anticipatory intuition similar to the Einsicht insight noticed by Kohler in various types of tasks, particularly in labyrinth learning with visual cues. The presence of the Einsicht reveals itself through a sudden increase in success rates, thus a discontinuity in the error curve over time. Experiments with detours have been attempted on a large number of animal species. Experiments with monkeys are now classic, as well as those with hens, which encounter much more difficulty than monkeys or dogs with the detour problem. Fischl presented tortoises with a detour problem by offering them a piece of worm behind a plexiglass partition. Success comes all at once. A similar apparatus was used by Pierron with octopi, and by Behrens Dahan on the same animal. The latter let an octopus see a crab up close. A glass partition invisible underwater and running halfway up the aquarium prevented the direct capture of the crab. When the stimulation was visual, what stops the octopus is the tactile and motor obstacle of the glass partition. Even if by chance one of the octopus's tentacles brushed the crab, there was no integration of this tactile sensorial datum with the initial problem posed in terms of visual stimuli. The tactile datum is nonetheless an indication that might trigger the solution of the detour problem, since the tentacle did effectuate a detour that enabled the capture of the crab. This observation is of great interest for the theoretical study of the detour as an invention. It shows that the perceptual integration of data from several senses is an important adjunct in the discovery of solutions. The concrete monosensorial perceptions must be transcended by a centralized activity of synthesis in order for the intuition of the solution to appear. We recoup here, even within a perceptual situation, the local activity that serves as a receptive system for sensorial signals. The cognitive context in which the detour situation may arise is more complex than the function of sense organs as receptors. When it can develop as a mode of multisensorial compatibility, the image, an active system of the reception of sensorial data, holds a reserve of solutions for concrete invention. In the same way, a roadmap is an always already reserve of itineraries. We now understand why the prior organization of a territory through multiple and various explorations is one of the conditions for the resolution of detour problems. For these provide the opportunity of developing images that render data from the various senses compatible. The possible detours pre-exist in the image, and the more precise the image is, the faster they are discovered. Moreover, the detour as a concrete invention finds a reciprocal form in the shortcut, which emerges as an improvement of behavior. For example, in the case of learning a labyrinth with several solutions, where it can also occur as a sudden invention. So I can see why Simondon likes these detour puzzles as an example, because they present this disparation of the obstacle and the goal that must be overcome to result in an invention, or at least a solution to the detour. and which, if the dispersion is too great, then the animal is unable to, resolve it into a solution, like the cat with the second type of chicken wire maze.
Yeah, so there's a few different conditions, I guess, that are necessary to allow an animal to perform this kind of invention and find the solution to the detour problem. So, like in the case of the maze, so you have Simondon describes this very quickly, but like the idea is you have one type of maze where the goal, the food or whatever, is at the center, and the animal is at the outside, and it's a spiral form. So the animal, as it goes around this spiral, it has to take detours. It can't take the direct route right towards the center because of the walls of the maze or the wire. So it has to take a detour to some extent. But what allows the animal to solve this problem is the fact that the detour is smaller and smaller as the animal gets closer and closer to the goal, right? So each loop of the spiral is smaller, and so the animal is getting closer and closer, or taking a smaller and smaller detour the closer it gets to the goal. Whereas the other type of maze is the animal is at the center of the spiral, and the goal is outside the spiral or on the edge of the spiral. And in the case of cats, at least in that experiment, they weren't able to solve this problem. And the reason is that as the animal is getting closer and closer to the goal, they actually have to take bigger and bigger detours. So it's like the sort of tendency or desire to go directly towards the goal that the animal has to repress to take this detour is getting stronger and stronger. So like you have to sort of, it takes more and more, I don't know, willpower might not be the right word, but it has a more and more difficult time of repressing this desire to go in the direction of the goal that it can see as it gets closer and closer to the goal. And so the animal ends up, instead of taking the detour and taking the whole loop around the spiral that it needs to take to get to the edge, it ends up just sort of going back and forth or sort of sticking to the closest point of the spiral to the goal instead of taking the whole loop and moving away from the goal in order to get closer to it later. So this is one condition, is that the animal has to sort of repress the desire to or it has to be able to repress this desire to go directly towards the goal, so that it has to understand or have some sort of grasp that by actually going away from the goal, I am overcoming an obstacle and getting myself ultimately closer to the goal than I would otherwise. And so, depending on the animal, the situation, and again, this probably depends on whether it's a laboratory setting or on the animal's own territory. The animal may or may not be able to solve this problem. And then the other condition that Simondon mentions here is sensory integration. So this octopus example is one where the octopus can see the target, the crab or whatever it was. You can see the object that it wants to get, and it might even, just by accident, one of its tentacles might go over the barricade in the cage, in the aquarium, and touch the crab just by accident. But it's not capable of, at least in this setting, of integrating, the fact that I can see the crab here and I can feel something on my tentacle here, and those two things coincide. And so my tentacle is actually touching the crab. It can't perform that sort of integration of the two sensory modalities and use that as the basis to say, okay, now I need to go around this obstacle and then I can get the crab. So again, this is a sort of second condition that the animal has to solve. It has to be able to integrate information coming from different sources to be able to realize, okay, I need to take a detour to get to my goal. And so again, this is a kind of creativity in the sense that the integration of these two pieces of information is not something given in the situation in advance. I mean, in a a sort of laboratory setting where the experimenter is controlling everything. Of course, the experimenter has an idea of what the solution to the problem is, but in sort of natural settings, there's no like pre-given solution to the problem. The animal has to actually creatively determine or discover how to put these two pieces of information together, how to make this connection, and what the appropriate response to that situation is. So this is why it's a kind of invention, even if it's not like a sort of it's a very limited invention in certain respects, but it's still required. It's more than just a sort of stimulus response type of behavior of this organism. The bit about the octopus makes me wonder. Because this is something that probably was not well known or recognized in Simondon's time, but they are actually, or at least some species of octopus, are quite intelligent. They are capable of creative behavior, problem solving, and so on. So it makes me wonder if this laboratory setting, in the way that Simondon describes, is sort of limiting the animal's capacity to execute the kinds of problem solving that it would be able to do in a natural setting. And so even something like just the fact of being captured and in an aquarium as opposed to swimming freely in the ocean, there's a sort of affective side of the laboratory setting that the animal is probably scared, and rather than sort of in a calm environment or environment where it feels safe and at home. And so this sort of affective side of things also interferes with the I'm sure even for humans we're all familiar with the phenomenon of being like frozen by fear or stage fright and things like that, where you sort of recognize that you're supposed to do something, but the fear of making a mistake is so powerful that you are not capable of executing that behavior. And so we can imagine that there might be something similar going on with the octopus, where the sort of affective side of captivity, the fear or disorientation or whatever, is overpowering the capacity to solve problems.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well. Like if I were captured and put in a strange laboratory, I would probably be easier to stump with like obstacle puzzles as well.
Yeah, and like if you just sort of kidnap someone and start giving them math problems or whatever, like they're probably not going to be like that effective at solving the problems, even if in a setting where they feel much more comfortable, they might not have any problem solving the equations or whatever you give them. So like just the sort of confidence. Yeah, exactly. And then so you kidnap someone, you deprive them of sleep or give them weird food that they never had before or whatever. And then 3 days later, you sort of like give them these math problems and try to see whether they can solve them or not. And then when they fail, you say, oh, this person can't do math. Well, maybe that's not exactly the right conclusion to draw from that sort of experiment when they're in this very unnatural situation, or a situation that is very stressful and emotionally difficult for that person. And I don't think there's any reason to think that it's different with animals, that the type of stress that a laboratory setting involves is probably similar, has a similar effect on other animals in terms of making it harder for them to perform the types of activities that they would do in a less stressful setting. And I think more recently, the last couple of decades, there's been more attempts to sort of allow animals to demonstrate their capacities in a more natural setting, as opposed to these sort of sterile lab environments, rats in a maze or something like that. And so a lot of cases where earlier studies had shown that this type of animal is not capable of solving this kind of problem, it turns out if you sort of modify the problem, make the maze more realistic, more similar to the animal's natural environment, then the animal is in fact capable of solving the problem. So it's not like navigation it's not that the animal is not capable of navigation, it's that the setting of this sort of weird laboratory environment is too overwhelming or too stressful for the animal, and it's not capable of exercising its navigation capacities. So yeah, it's always difficult in animal psychology or studies of animal behavior to sort of figure out what the correct conditions are in which an animal can perform a certain type of behavior, and what, if the animal doesn't exhibit the behavior you're looking for, it's always hard to infer, this is what, it's because the animal is lacking this psychological capacity, as opposed to the setting is not suitable for the animal to exercise that capacity. So yeah, it's a very interesting problem in animal psychology, or like methodology of animal psychology. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So if I can get someone to read from the section or subsection heading instrumental mediation and read a page or so. We scared someone away by asking them to read. Okay, I can read the next bit, but yeah, hopefully someone will take the lead on the next one after that. Okay, subsection 2, instrumental mediation. The recruitment of an object originally belonging to the external milieu is used as instrument was long considered, especially by philosophers and moralists, as a specific display of human intelligence, hence the label Homo faber, chosen to designate our species. The Stoics often reprised the following theme. Each animal species is endowed with specialized organs for defense, attack, shelter, construction, etc. Humans, by contrast, have neither organ tools, pincer or auger, nor innate operative knowledge to use them without prior learning. They must fashion tools and learn to use them. But the equipment and innate knowledge of animals is limited, given once and for all as a feature of the species, while human capacities are not limited. What at first represents an infirmity, a lack of inbuilt equipment, also ensures an ultimate superiority. Such ideas are found among Sophists and Lucretius, along with a more general idea of how progress is closely linked to inventive capacities and their impact on society. It was then a conspicuous commonplace for thought in antiquity, and it can even be found in mythology with Icarus and Prometheus. Yet the use of instruments does take place among animal species under conditions which, at times, point to a stereotyped activity generally found among the various individuals of the species, and at other times are rarer and seem attributable instead to individual invention. In 1905, the Peckhams observed a wasp, Amophilia ornaria, tamping down the ground over its nest with a small rock held in its mandibles. Was this a case of individual invention? Minkiewicz, in 1933, observed solitary wasps in Poland performing the same operation with the scales of birch fruits, which implies a certain plasticity and adaptability to the parameters of the milieu in instrumental selection. In spite of this, Pierron considers that in such cases we cannot speak of invention, individual invention, but rather of an analogical conflation or instinctual extension. The maneuver is habitual to all members of the species which owns the recipe. The tropical red ant living in mango trees, Ecophila smaragdina, brings several leaves together with 6 or 7 ants pulling them, then glues them edge to edge using a thread-secreting larva as shuttle. Ridley, Dofline, Bignon, and Hingston have observed this construction of nests made of leaves in other ant species of the genus Polyrhachis or the Camponotus senex. There too, this behavior involving the use of a living being as tool or instrument is a species-wide recipe enabling a collective behavior with a division of labor. Some workers keep the leaves in place edge to edge while others manipulate the larvae. We can thus speak of organization but not of individual invention, even if there is a use of instrumental mediation similar to that in human artisanal activity. Lancio and Roussy have noted the way some spiders use a small pebble as a web-tensing weight when a lower anchoring thread could not be attached for lack of available support points. This case is comparable to the various instrumental uses cited above, yet it arises in conditions in which the instrument replaces, as a fragment detached from other objects, an opportunity the situation could have offered on its own. A small pebble brought in corresponds to a reorganization of the milieu. This case establishes a continuity between simple organizations, tamping of soil or digging, and the use of an instrument detached from the milieu and reattached to the organism as a prosthesis. Vieille studied the use of instrumental mediations among monkeys in situations where, unable to reach a goal directly, for instance, a fruit suspended high above in the cage, these animals either used connected sticks, the end of one embedded in another, or a scaffolding of boxes or a ladder provided in their cage with other objects. The observed behavior implements a perceptual selection with long objects, a plank or stick, recruited first as instruments. The construction of an instrument per se requires a higher capacity of integration and a prior experience of manipulation. Only higher primates who spontaneously manipulate sticks placed at their disposal before any finalized behavior succeed later in embedding the segments of sticks to resolve the problem of the fruit suspended above the cage. We might say that in such a case it is the image of the embedding, as perceptual motor reality, that is recruited at the moment of difficulty, and that the use of the instrument to be reconstructed is discovered through a mental image already constituted during open learning, comparable to an exploration for structuring the territory. We witness here the importance of the role played by the spontaneity of behaviors initially containing motor components, need for exploration, manipulation play, that serve as systems for the reception of perceptual data. It is through these motor components that an active mental image is constituted and can serve as solution for a problem. A mere perceptual investigation when the problem is presented does not lead to selecting objects as mediators, but without adequate discernment, a mere perceptual investigation when the problem is presented does lead to selecting objects as mediators, but without adequate discernment of their complex operative properties. Hence, assembled boxes or a ladder given to monkeys are chosen for their perceptual qualities as scaffolding components, but without respect for the rules of equilibrium in their stacking or wedging against a wall, which would correspond to forcible embedding of the sticks. The monkey indifferently places a small box on a larger one than the reverse. It places the ladder vertically against the wall without slanting it. If the monkey reaches the goal in these conditions, it is by using these objects as momentary support to jump rather than by climbing, I think it should say, which requires the mechanical conditions of stable equilibrium. Instrumental invention requires not only a perception, but also a complete mental image forged by the motor components involved in manipulation and exploration. Right, so here we have sort of the next stage of invention, which is using an instrument outside of the organism's body. So some of these simple cases are like you have the ones that Köhler had studied in apes. You have the animal is in a cage, and there's something that the animal wants, a piece of fruit or food of some kind that is at the top of the cage, and the animal can't reach it. And then there's a bunch of objects in the cage, and some of those objects are useful or could be useful if they're used in the right way. So there's like sticks that you can sort of clamp into each other, and if you do it the right way, then you have a stick that's long enough to reach the fruit hanging at the top of the cage. Or there are boxes that you can stack on top of each other, or in some cases a ladder. So there's different versions of this experiment, and it turns out that the apes are only able to solve this problem if they have previously played with the objects. So if you just like throw them into the cage and there's a bunch of objects and there's the fruit that they want to get at the top of the cage, they can't solve the problem. They can't figure out, okay, I need to stack these boxes and then I can climb up on top and reach the fruit. But if they have previously explored these objects, if they've gone around and stacked boxes and tried to climb them and things like that, then when they reach the situation where the fruit is at the top of the cage and they can't reach it, they sort of understand, okay, now I can do the same thing as I did earlier. I can stack these boxes, or I can clamp these sticks into each other, and I can reach the fruit. So this sort of undirected behavior of play or manipulating the objects with no particular goal is a sort of exploratory prerequisite for the goal-directed behavior, the actual invention process of realizing that this object can be used to bring about to reach the goal that they're trying to get to. So Simondon compares this to the exploration of the territory. So in the same way that the animal has to explore its territory before it's capable of performing a detour on that territory, likewise, the animal has to explore what the properties of these objects are, how they interact with each other, how they fit together, and so on, before it's capable of inventing the use of this object to achieve a goal. Yeah, in the case of these ants is especially interesting. Yeah, so Angus has posted some pictures in the chat here of some of these ants that like sew leaves together. Ants in general have like pretty fascinating behavior. There are some ants that essentially cultivate a certain kind of fungus. They grow it in their nests. So they like feed it and collect it from outside and bring it into their nests and so on. Um, yeah. Anyway, so ants like use a variety of instruments or elements of the environment. They use them to bring about a goal. The question is always though, like to what extent is this a real invention on the part of an individual ant or a colony of ants, or is this a sort of instinctual behavior? Is this something that is sort of pre-programmed that the ant will perform this type of behavior? And it's always difficult, especially with something like an ant. It's always hard to demonstrate that this is like an invention in the sense of a novel behavior, as opposed to something that's sort of predetermined. But so it's much easier in the case of an ape to get it to figure out, okay, I need to stack these boxes to get to the banana, as opposed to with ants, it's much harder to get them to perform novel behaviors that as opposed to ones that are typical of their species. 61, I see you unmuted. Are you ready to read a passage for us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sure. Are we at an adjacent problem?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. An adjacent problem to that of the instrument used to reach a goal is that of the instrument used to pull an object beyond direct reach, especially with the aid of a string or thread attached to that object, with or without obstacles, or cage bars, that make the processing of relations more complex. Bierhans de Haan found goldfinches capable of resolving this problem on the first attempt, while others needed to learn the maneuver. Earhart states that such traction actions are routinely used in the natural living conditions of several species of birds, such as tits and goldfinches, as well as the action of jamming a fruit into the hollows of bark to eat it among nuthatches. Bullfinches proceed similarly to break open pine cone scales, and gulls and ravens break hard shells by dropping them from high above rocks. In a certain sense, there is a continuity between detour, instrument recruitment from the milieu, and indirect behaviors such as that of a bird lifting a hard shell in the air and letting it go so it will break on rocks. Such indirect behaviors abound in the operative modes of various species. I have witnessed the European red ant make use of gravity to move loads. Rather than carrying them one by one from a wooden plank 5 feet from the ground, the ants successively threw the loads. They were in fact ant corpses, then climbed down to the ground to complete transportation, after having unhooked a few dead ants stuck on wood fibers at the edge of the cut plank. However, the ant did not recuperate a number of corpses which, diverted by the wind, fell on a table rather than on the ground. This behavior is akin to that of the discovery of a shortcut, since the total length of travel and the labor time was reduced by a factor of 15 compared to up and down round trips. But is this an individual invention or a species-wide behavior? Certainly it is a behavior finely adapted to the situation, effective, quick, and expedient, although it leads to a certain waste in the load. But I haven't been able to conduct sufficient observations to determine whether the use of freefall to lower loads is spread among ants. In all likelihood, this was a perfectly individual behavior and outside the anthill, which proves that behaviors we might call, with reference to human norms of task management, ingenious, are not merely collective among insects.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, this is the next sort of stage of the problem-solving, I don't know, hierarchy, I guess we could say. So it's not just that so the simple sort of first stage is to take an object like a bunch of boxes and stack them up in a way that gets you closer to the goal. This is a slightly more complicated task in that you use an object of some kind to bring the goal closer to you. So you have to, so in this case, it's like pulling something on a string, for example. So it's somewhat more complicated because you have to understand the relationship between the string and the food or whatever the goal is, and yourself, and you have to realize, okay, if I pull on this string, then I can get the goal. And so he points out here that this behavior is something that obviously is, objects with strings on them is a sort of unnatural phenomenon. It's not like in the wild, most animals don't encounter this, but there are similar behaviors that certain birds will do. They will use elements of the environment to make the goal more reachable. And so he talks about, for example, gulls and ravens that will pick up shells of mollusks, clams or whatever, and fly up in the air and then drop them onto the rocks. And then when the shell breaks, they get to the animal inside. And there's, I think it was in Japan. There's some crows that have figured out that they can put a shell, a clam or something, on the road and then wait for a car to drive over it and then get to the clam inside. And there's been this is sort of famous now about like crows and how smart they are. So I posted something in the chat here. There's a clip of so this task for the crows. I think they were New Guinea crows, if I remember correctly. They had to not just use a string to pull on something to bring it to themselves, but they had to use a stick to use a small stick to pull a bigger stick, and then use the bigger stick to grab a piece of meat. So they had to figure out not just the relationship between the piece of meat and like a string or something that they can pull on, but they had to figure out the relationship between if I had a stick, I could grab the meat, and here's a stick, but I can't reach the stick. But here's another stick that I can use to grab the first stick. So they have to figure out all of these relationships at the same time. And so this is a much more sophisticated problem-solving task than just stacking some boxes so that you can reach the banana. So I think there's been more and more research on crows and other corvids, other birds in the same family, that they're capable of these sort of intellectual detours. So it's similar to the detour behavior where you actually sort of move your whole body in a direction that takes you temporarily away from the goal, but now it's an intellectual detour. You have to figure out the relationship between different elements of the environment and determine that doing this thing that doesn't seem initially to help you at all in your goal, in reaching your goal, it actually is necessary to because of the way these elements of the environment are connected to each other. If you perform this task, which seems irrelevant, it actually does get you closer to the goal. And then we have also this interesting observation of the ants. So this is something that Simondon is reporting on his own observations. So there's a bunch of ants that are trying to bring dead ants back to the nests, I guess. Or anyway, they're on a piece of wood that's up in the air, 5 feet above the ground, and what they could do is pick up each individual dead ant and bring them all the way down, like carry them from the board down whatever supports it's on, and then walk all the way to the nest. But what Simondon observes them doing instead is just throwing them off the edge of the board and then climbing down and picking up the bodies on the ground and then carrying them to the nest. So this behavior allows them to skip having to drag the body all the way down the whatever structure is supporting this piece of wood. Instead, they just use the force of gravity to drop the body where they want it. And so Simondon points out that some of the bodies get blown away by the wind. So they lose a certain amount of what they were trying to carry, but it's sort of a trade-off between that and the energy that would be required to drag them all the way. So there's it's a sort of engineering problem of which task, is it more important to ensure that you collect every body, or is it more important to save energy on the dragging? And so in this situation, the ants, in effect, opted to lose some of the load that they were carrying in exchange for saving energy on the dragging operation. And so Simondon suggests, he doesn't sort of say this conclusively, but he suggests that this is a kind of individual problem-solving behavior on the part of the ants, it doesn't seem like this is a sort of pre-structured behavior that the ants do universally, or that the species of ant does universally. It's not something that the ants already had like hardwired into them. They sort of evaluated a situation and found a way of reconciling the sort of disparate elements of the situation and saving energy. And so in a human engineer or technician or whatever, we would recognize this as a creative way of solving a problem. And so Simondon was suggesting that we should do the same in the case of these ants. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. If I can get someone to read. Yeah, we can read up to the next subsection break, please.
I can read. The most common argument against calling these accomplishments among animals, quote-unquote, inventions, maintains that such behaviors are widely found across the species. This is what Pierron calls a species-wide recipe. If the behavior is stereotyped, it is indeed not an invention, yet the fact that a behavior is encountered often within a species does not prove that it does not result from a multitude of concurring and parallel inventions. The extreme complexity of the conditions of human action means that inventions are usually signaled by a dispersion of operative modes, while the use of a learned formula, a recipe, leads to uniformity. Yet if we take into account the leaner framework and far more limited action systems of most animal species, the uniformity of operative modes does not prove the absence of an invention process, since the number of possibilities is limited. This is why it is reasonable to consider as a criterion of inventive adaptation a response through organized and economical behavior to random factors arising during the execution of a task, either using them if favorable or neutralizing them if unfavorable. The problem of the capacity for invention among animals coincides here with their intelligence. Observations and experiments have been conducted, particularly by Fabre, on burying beetles trying to bury a mole tied by the experimenter to a stick that prevents it from being lowered. The beetles end up surfacing to assess the situation, discover the string, and cut it. Viaud comments on this experiment, which he sees, contrary to Fabre, as a sign of intelligence in the beetle's reaction. Viaud adds observations he conducted in the Alsatian plain on burying beetles trying to bury a vole in ground crevices, exploring the shape of the crevice before orienting it, and slanting the flattened corpse of the vole so that it better slides into the properly sized crevice. In human life, as in animal life, there is a constant necessity to confront the partial novelty of situations with an activity of organization of operative modes. The richer and more precise the mental image of the situation, the higher are the chances of discovering an adequate organization. The simplest invention is that which bears on operative modes because there is homogeneity among the modes, which involve motor schemas, and the representation of the problem. The discovery of practical solutions, of praxis, is very much analogous to the simplifications and structurations arising during learning. For a problem to be solved, it must first be posed in coherent, that is, homogeneous terms, belonging to a single system, the same axiomatic. Operative modes with their motor content constitute by themselves the most elementary axiomatic, which has no need of being constructed since it is given by the organism. But it is still necessary that all of the terms of the problem have been converted into operative terms, so that a distance between objects would be a path effectively taken, and a mass is something that has already been lifted with a given effort or has resisted efforts of moving it. This is why the condition for concrete inventions is prior exploration, manipulation, and organization of the territory in which the problem will arise, and the instruments of a solution will be found. Throughout this activity, there are translations into homogeneous operative terms of the dimensions and properties of things, as though in an implicit algebra, the felt relations of objects with capacities for action perform the most primitive formalizations. This point that he makes about the distinction between the species-wide recipe and genuine invention, kind of interesting in light of what we were talking about before the call, before we started recording, about practical reason and rule following. It seems like if there is something like an instinctive recipe, then if there is a novel enough interruption of the instinctive behavior, a solution to the problem presented by the interruption would be invention if the obstacle is actually resolved.
Yeah, that's interesting. You can have in most sort of animal behavior experiments, you're still relying on the animal to present some sort of instinctive behavior, if you want to use that term. For example, you present the animal with food that it likes or that it would normally eat. You don't give, I don't know, hay to a dog or a cat or whatever. You give it meat or something that it would eat in a normal setting. And so you have to sort of align with the animal's behaviors in a normal setting in order to even conduct the experiment in the first place. But you can take that sort of species typical behavior and present a sort of obstacle to the effectuation or to the reaching of a goal. And then that requires the animal to not just perform this sort of pre-established recipe or this preset behavior, but it has to sort of have an understanding of the situation and find a way of taking the goal and the obstacle and sort of figuring out what the relationship of these two things is to each other and overcoming the obstacle. These examples with the beetles are pretty interesting because, we don't think of beetles or insects in general as being especially intelligent. But here, you have these beetles that, I don't know exactly what species of beetle, but that seem to have this species typical behavior of burying dead animals, presumably so that they can eat the decaying flesh later on. But in this instance, the animal is suspended on a string, and so when they start digging underneath the animal, it doesn't fall like it normally would. Burying beetle, interesting. So the animal doesn't fall into the ground, into the hole that they're digging in the way that it normally would. So the sort of typical behavior is just you dig underneath this animal, and then it sinks into the ground, and then eventually you can sort of bury it. But in this case, they start digging underneath the carcass, and it doesn't fall into the hole. And then after a while, they stop digging, and they realize, okay, there's something that's gone wrong, or something is not normal here. They do some investigation, and they find the string, and then they cut the string, and then everything proceeds as normal. So, they whatever exactly representation of the problem they have. Presumably not a sort of sophisticated knowledge of the action of gravity or something, but they figured out that the string is the sort of obtrusive element here, that the string is what is preventing the normal behavior from proceeding the way it should. And then once they eliminate the string as an obstacle, then they can sort of perform their normal behavior. And so here, this phenomenon of being suspended on a string is clearly not a typical. It's not something that they have a preset recipe for. They have to have some sort of grasp, of where the obstacle is, of why things are not proceeding as normal, and it might be sort of an accidental. They probably didn't have a sophisticated understanding of the way that strings will hold objects suspended in the air. They might have just sort of figured out the string is weird and not normal, and they just sort of attack the string that is the obtrusive element in the situation, and then eventually, just sort of by accident, they end up solving the problem. It's still a sort of sophisticated behavior of being able to figure out which element of the situation it actually is the obstacle to being able to perform the species typical behavior. So I think that's again, it's always difficult to determine just how sophisticated, how much actual understanding of a situation an animal is exhibiting when it performs a certain behavior. Like in this case, we clearly would not want to attribute sort of an understanding of how strings counteract the force of gravity or something along those lines to the beetles. They're most likely just sort of randomly trying different things until one thing works. But we still want to, attribute at least the capacity to recognize that the situation is not proceeding as normal and they need to try something different, which is already a sort of intellectual detour. If we sort of considered them to be like sort of mechanically proceeding, they would just keep digging and digging and never realize, okay, the corpse of this animal is not actually sinking into the ground the way it should. So yeah, they are capable of recognizing when things are not going wrong or are not going well, and how to sort of explore the situation and find the point where things are with sort of the bottleneck of the situation. Where is it that things are going wrong? This bit about beetles, it's sort of off topic, but it reminds me of a famous line from Darwin that probably a lot of people have heard. But like someone asked him, like, what can we learn about the creator from examining the creation? And he says he seems to have an inordinate fondness for beetles, because there's like, I think there's more species of beetles than there are any other form of insect or something like that. But anyway, there's like hundreds of thousands of species of beetles. Yeah, so these are animals that, again, we don't consider to be like especially intelligent or sophisticated in various ways. But even something simple like, investigating why the corpse of the animal is not sinking into the ground and, finding the problem is already exhibiting a certain amount of sophistication. It requires some sort of understanding of the situation. Right. So we're kind of losing people, but I'm going to suggest we read this one last subsection, and then that'll take us to the section break, and then we end there for today, if that works for everyone. Okay. 61, do you want to read?
Sure. Okay, so number 3, right? Okay.
Yes, exactly.
The properties, 1 second. Okay. The properties common to detour and instrumental mediation. Both of these cases concern the selective recruitment of certain data from past experience by the present representation of the concrete goal to be reached. Invention as an organization is in this respect a detour through the past. In past experience, in the course of explorations and manipulations, relations were established, sometimes fortuitously, between the organism and the object constituting the goal. In a problematic situation characterized by discontinuity, the proximity of the goal and the intensity of the motivation create a strong slope, an important gradient field that interacts with a whole population of images condensing past experience. This interaction between the field of finality, that is, the gradient of the goal of the anticipated action, and the field of experience, leads paradoxically to a simple situation, but intense because of the tension towards a goal that is near, that of modulating a population of mental images bearing the results of explorations and manipulations that have required a very lengthy and complex activity. An organization occurs because the simplest and smallest structure, a goal to be reached in the present situation, governs a larger and more complex set with a weaker gradient. This condition is formally the same as that of an amplification through interaction between fields. If learning processes were as forcefully polarized as problematic situations, then an organizing invention would not be possible because its condition, namely the amplifying recruitment of images already previously constituted by the problem's field of immediate finality, would lack its basic condition, that is, a gain superior to unity, thanks to a coupling as irreversible as that between the present and the past. For amplification to exist, the images condensing past experience must be as close as possible to a neutral state without being entirely neutral, since then they would no longer offer any purchase on the field of modulation developed by the finalizing situation. We can understand then why violently stimulating situations, such as intense emotions, excesses of reward or of punishment, do not leave easily usable, mobile, and combinable images for a later problematic situation, whereas disinterested learning, which is weakly polarized, optimally prepares inventive organization. In order for invention to have the best chance of arising, what is required is an alternation between long durations, in which activity is weakly motivated and weakly finalized, free exploration and manipulation, and short durations with high goal gradients, or problematic situations. We may call a gain the ratio of measures these durations entering into a relation of interaction, and finding an equilibrium as fields of experience and of finality within the problematic situation. It is then not solely the association of memories or the evocation of mental images that enables an organizing invention. If a present image developed by the finalizing situation triggers a single image from the past that carries an experience, an image sufficiently polarized to balance and neutralize the present image, the ratio is 1-to-1, which means there is no amplification. Overly accentuated images do not enable invention, but only iteration and preservation. For images to be instruments of invention, conforming to the finalized situation where they organize themselves, they must be in a state close to neutrality while remaining weakly charged. This state of weak polarization corresponds to the end result of the process of saturation described above, which occurs after the experience of the object. A strongly polarized image of a scheme or project, or fear of desire, cannot be the material for a practical invention bearing on reality, but only the content of phantasm. Images that express the desire to fly have hardly contributed to the invention of the airplane. The most modest of practical inventions is also the result of an act of amplification, which profits in only a few instances from a long and scarcely finalized learning, producing mobile and detachable images following the lines of force of field of finality.
Right. This bit is a bit dense compared to some of the earlier parts, but the sort of basic idea here, as far as I understand, is that there has to be a sort of weakly goal-directed structure of a situation to allow for the sort of mobility of the images in learning. So, for example, the case of the cat that couldn't figure out how to go around the spiral, traveling from the inside to the outside. In this situation, the attraction to the food or the whatever the goal is was too strong to allow the cat to travel around the loop of the spiral in the direction away from the goal. And so in this situation, it's this the situation is structured too strongly or is too sort of too strongly goal directed for the cat to learn how to reach the goal. Whereas in other situations where the cat might, or whatever the animal is, doesn't have this same sort of very strong goal directed sort of structure of the situation. So the cat might just play with a piece of string or whatever, or some sort of object in the environment. It might sort of use it and manipulate it without any particular goal in mind. And then later on, it can sort of use that manipulation of the object without a goal. It can sort of rely on the images of that object, the motor and visual and etc. images, to allow it to solve a problem where it does have a goal-directed, or it does have a strong direction towards a goal. So there has to be both, on the one hand, the prior exploratory behavior with no particular goal or with only limited amount of finality in the situation or directedness towards a goal. And then there also has to be the problem, the setting where there is a goal to be reached, and there has to be a sort of conjunction of these two elements for learning and problem solving to happen. And so Simondon points out that this sort of strong desire, even in humans, the strong desire to reach a certain goal, is in some cases in some cases it interferes with the problem solving process. So this desire to fly produces all sorts of fantasies of flight, of transforming into a bird or whatever, but it's mostly doesn't really get you any closer to the problem or to the solution of building an airplane that required, of course, all sorts of prior technical inventions of the internal combustion motor and so on. So there's again this sort of capacity to explore the terrain, whether actually physically the territory in which the animal lives, or sort of intellectual terrain. This kind of low motivation behavior is a prerequisite for the capacity to solve a problem in a high motivation setting.
This section is really interesting, but as you mentioned, really dense. But this idea of the ratio that present image developed by the finalizing situation triggers a single image from the past that carries an experience. The image sufficiently polarized to balance and neutralize the present image. The ratio is 1-to-1, which means there's no amplification. So would amplification here be the correspondence of a series of low polarization past images to the high polarization future goal image? And in that case, maybe, I'm trying to think if we can think of that kind of amplification in terms of, like the crystal propagating through the milieu, where the milieu here would be the group of low polarized past images, and the seed would correspond to the high intensity goal. But it's pretty vague.
Yeah. So I think the passage that you just read, the part where he talks about the ratio being 1-to-1. So this is the situation where there hasn't been an appropriate learning sort of low intensity series. So in the case where you have, I don't know, this very strong desire to fly, and then you sort of this one image of a bird's flight comes to mind, and you're stuck on this one image of the desire to fly just brings up this image of a bird's flight. Then you're not going to realize that you actually have to build an airplane to be able to fly. You're going to sort of try to come up with a device that allows you to flap your arms like a bird's wings or something like that. You're going to go down the wrong path. And so this is in this situation, the ratio is 1-to-1 in the sense that there's no amplification of the image doesn't amplify your capacity to operate and to reach your goal. Whereas in the situation where you have had this prerequisite exploration, there is an amplification. So the situation doesn't just call up one image that you sort of get fixated on or stuck on. It calls up a whole series of images where you've explored the properties of your territory or the properties of the objects that you find in your situation. And it calls up not just like the sort of objective properties, but what you can do with those objects. And then you realize, oh, if I've taken these boxes and stacked them together before, and if I do that now, then I can reach the banana. It's this sort of connection. Yeah. So in the case of the flight example, you would have this sort of pre-existing exploratory knowledge, and not even just of one person, but of a whole society of internal combustion engine metallurgy to develop the materials that are strong enough to strong and light enough to build an airplane. Aerodynamics, all these other sort of elements of knowledge and of technical capacity that all have to come together to build this device that doesn't look at or function anything like a bird does. And so this all these different aspects of the situation. So this desire to fly has to elicit or call up all of these different elements of the situation, all this sort of prerequisite knowledge and technical capacity. It has to bring all of that to bear on the problem, as opposed to just like the one image of a bird flying. And so it's in that sense that the situation amplifies the capacity to act and to reach the goal. And so this, like in the case of the cat that can't solve the spiral maze problem, we can say that the cat is sort of fixated on the image of heading in the direction of the food. It just has this one sort of image of like, here's the food, here's the direction I need to travel, and it can't sort of combine that with its prior knowledge of the structure of the spiral maze and figure out, okay, I need to actually move away from the food so that I can go around the loop of the spiral, and that will actually get me closer to my goal. So again, this very strongly affectively charged or polarized situation doesn't allow for the cat to sort of figure out the structure of the situation, use its knowledge of the structure of the environment in such a way as to amplify its capacity to reach the goal. Yeah, and then there's the bit that we haven't really talked about is the bit about the past that he right at the beginning of this section. So there's a kind of detour into the past, is how he puts it, right? So you in a situation where you have to solve a problem, you are not just taking a detour in the present situation, but you're detouring through your past experience of the territory, of the objects that you've played with in the past. You're sort of going back into your past experience and all the images that you've collected in that experience, motor images, visual images, etc. And then you're taking that detour to come up with a new path that you hadn't perceived before, or that you didn't realize was there. And so this is it's in this sense that invention is a detour through the past, because you have to use the past experience in that low polarization setting as a way to find this amplificatory response to this high polarization situation. Okay, so if there's no other, sorry, Angus, did you have a question or comment?
I was just going to say, so I was confused at first about this emphasis on the difference in polarization, but I guess the point is that if the polarization of the future image is too similar to the polarization of the past, of a given past image, then it would be either a one-to-one correspondence or closer to a one-to-one correspondence. But it's because if the past images have a lower polarization, you need more of them to correspond to the higher polarization of the future image. I mean, I guess that's kind of metaphorically what he's saying here, that no one sort of item that you've learned in the past would be sufficient to achieve the end goal, or like make the future image present. You need the combination of all of them, which would be what he means by amplification.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously there's like what exactly this quantity that's being amplified is somewhat vague here, but there's a certain equilibrium of like this very powerful image of a future state of me eating the banana or whatever the situation is, which is very polarized towards a particular goal state, and then to sort of counterbalance this future image, you need the whole sort of knowledge of, or the whole set of images, the whole experience that arose through exploration, or this low polarization behavior in relation to the environment. So it's like there's a certain, I guess, trade-off between quantity and intensity here, that like a low intensity image in order to counterbalance a high intensity image, you need lots of low intensity images. And then so in the situation where you have high intensity future image of eating the banana, and it gets sort of fixated on just one high intensity past image, then you don't have this amplificatory process of allowing the whole experience of the situation to come to bear on the problem and sort of bring about a solution. Yeah, it's all about getting the banana. That's what Fichte was writing about when he talks about the primacy of the practical, is how to get a banana.
That's why they kicked him out of Jena.
Right, okay. So thanks everyone for coming out. We're going to stop here for today. So we'll pick up next time from from section B on page 152. Okay, so thanks again, and see you. Let me see. Yes, I think I can do next week, but it might be a short session next week. I have to figure that out.
That sounds good. Thanks, 9 and 61.